Welcome to another edition of Know Your Trees by Justin and Zion. As you can see, we're in the woodlot out back here in western Washington. It's late February. There's still snow on the ground, which is a little unusual for this time of year. It's been on the ground for about 3 weeks now. And today we're going to talk about tapping maple trees to make maple syrup.
Okay, how do you tap maple trees?
So we'll go over that as we go about the trees. I can show you the different pieces that are necessary in order to harvest the sap and turn into syrup. But first I want to talk a little bit about the trees that we're tapping. The trees that we're using are Bigleaf Maple. Typically, maple syrup that you buy in the store is made from the sugar maple, which is a tree that you find in the northeast of the United States. Its Latin name is Acer saccharum, saccharum meaning sugar. Acer is the genus of the maple trees.
What's genus mean?
Genus is the beginning of the Latin name, so it qualifies all trees as a maple tree, and then from there they break it down into different subgroups that makes a family out of each different distinct kind of maple tree. And there's many different kind of maple trees, not all of which have sugar content in their sap. There's a number of which do, the sugar maple being the main sugar producing maple.
So what's the difference between a big leaf maple and small leaf or sugar maple?
Well, there's no small leaf maple, but the sugar maple is not native to the western US like the big leaf maple is. The big leaf maple can have big leaves, hence the name, up to a foot in diameter. The sugar maple is much smaller leaves. The sugar maple has a much higher sugar content in their sap. However, the big leaf maple has a very nice sugar content in its sap that produces a really nice syrup. And there's a couple others that produce good syrups too, being the red maple, of which we have some planted lower down in the property that are still quite small, and the Norway maple will also produce sap. But today we're talking about the big leaf maple, found west of the Rockies in most states, north of Nevada. And you can see here, if you pan the camera over, we're in an area that was logged about 40 years ago and never replanted. It was probably once mostly Douglas fir and western hemlock, which would be a subclimatic species. And after those are cut, usually the maples take over and sprout quite vigorously, and you can see the whole hillside is covered in really nice maples. We have the south over here, so we get good sun. What you're really looking for is cold nights and warm days to get that sap flowing a little bit before spring, and that's what we're going to tap around and collect our sap.
So do some maple trees produce more than others?
Yeah, and we'll see that as we go around and collect that. Some will be much more full than others. I also wanted to say one thing that I've noticed as I've been doing this for the last few years is kind of the time to know when to do it. This is an Indian plum right here, which is a small shrub native to this area. And when the Indian plum starts to bud, you can see it's throwing out some green buds here. That's about the time you want to tap your trees, which is typically mid-February. Some people tap them all winter and have iffy production throughout most of the winter. It depends on the fluctuation in temperatures, and you can get some, but we don't want to stress the trees, so we try to do it for the shortest amount of time as possible. But when the Indian plum starts to bud, tap your trees. When the Indian plum flowers, which is going to be in about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, the sap's usually all done. The sap will turn cloudy and stop running as vigorously, and that's when we pull the taps and call it a year of maple syrup production. here is all just salmonberry. This area is pretty wet, so it's got a lot of salmonberry bushes, and in the early spring it's full of nettle, which is another good plant to wildcraft, which we'll probably do a video on that when the time comes. But bucket fell off a little bit. That's not really what we want. We're gonna switch these out with the jugs at some point. Most common plant, it really depends on where you are and what the habitat's like for that specific plant. I mean, like I was saying, in this zone you can see it's full of all sort of shrubby undergrowth dominated by a overstory of maple and alder and birch, which is a pretty common pioneer mix in this area after the conifers have been cut. The conifers being the plants like the trees like the western hemlock and the cedars and the Douglas firs will dominate for many years, because lots of those trees are very long lived. They can live for hundreds and hundreds of years. The alder is an interesting tree. You see a lot of them here, like this one, and here's a pretty big one that's starting to fall apart. It's pretty old. There's lots of alders in here. The alder is a very important species around here. It's a nitrogen fixer, so it can actually take nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it into the soil, which makes the soil more beneficial for other plants to thrive. So it's our most true pioneer species that will come back into really infertile ground, areas that have been degraded heavily. The alder will colonize and help to fix nitrogen in the soil, and nitrogen being one of the main nutrients for plant growth. It can be really good to help bring back a degraded area, especially as one of our native species, and also makes a very good clean burning firewood that you can coppice as well.
What's coppice mean?
So you can take a alder tree of some age, like it needs to be fairly old, at least like 6 to 8 inches in diameter, which is about the diameter of this bucket here, or that tree right there. Like that'd be a good example, that skinny one in front of the larger one. Now if you cut that tree 2 feet above the ground, it would sprout from the stump that you cut. So you could harvest the firewood that you cut down, and then you could let it sprout, and then in another 12 years you could harvest multiple sprouts that would have gained about this big a size. So you'd have probably four shoots coming out that are 4 to 6 inches in diameter that then you could harvest again for firewood, and then it would sprout again. All the while it's fixing nitrogen in the soil, helping your maple trees around it. So it's a really cool tree in that regard. It was also used often by the native people here for smoking fish, as it has a really nice wood smoke aroma to it. So we got really good flow today from the maple trees.
Aren't you gonna tap these ones right here?
Yeah, I usually try to work my way back so I don't have to carry a heavy bucket. And we're on this fence line right behind me. This barbed wire fence of our neighbor's pasture is to the south. So these trees do really good that are on this fence line with a full southern exposure. They seem to be our best producing trees. I'm finding that some of the trees that are sort of, I don't know, I guess shadowed more, or kind of in an understory, maybe with like a large Doug fir in front of them, they don't do quite as well as See, this one's still dripping here.
So basically, they need a lot of sun in the day and it to be really cold in the night.
That's what I'm finding. And I'm not sure what the case is in the Northeast where they do the sugar maples, but yeah, it seems a lot of the trees here like to warm when they're warming up during the day and they cool down at night. Then they start their sap starts running really vigorously in the springtime, in the early spring. It's not quite spring yet, but
there's a lot of sap in these ones.
yeah. So I'll show you what the tap looks like. So empty this bucket. So this is the tap. It's also called the stile, S-T-I-L-E. And basically, we drill into the tree about 2 inches, which is the cambium layer of the tree, the outer layer that is growing. A tree grows concentrically from inside out. Each year, a tree doesn't grow up, it actually grows out and then up. So we're tapping into the cambium layer, the very outermost layer, and in this time of year, going into the springtime, as the sun increases its length of day and the temperatures warm up, they start pulling sap from their roots down in the earth, and sap's flowing all throughout this tree. The whole outer 2-inch layer is running up, and they're running it all the way to their buds up into the canopy. So they're starting to bring sugar and starch up to the buds, so they're ready to produce leaves when the time comes. And we were a little concerned about harming the trees by drilling into them, because anytime the bark of a tree is its defense, right? It's like its clothes, its outermost layer that protects it against insects and weather and all that stuff. And so we were a little concerned about that process of drilling in and then causing a hole. But you can see this is a hole from last year right here, and it completely calloused up and healed. So the tree closed this wound on its own, and now it's totally protected again against insects and disease and bacterium and things that might get into the inner workings of the tree and harm it. We had thought about maybe plugging some of the holes with wax, and I had done that on some of them. This is one I did not do it on, and I found that it didn't really matter. The trees were able to heal such a small wound on their own, and you can see it's got a whole layer of hard bark again, and nothing can get in there. Eventually there'll still be a small divot, but as the tree continues to grow out, it'll be completely sealed and free from any harm. You want to be careful to make sure you select healthy trees. Like this tree right here, I had a little concern about tapping. It's been productive. My concern was this large wound here, and I could have tapped it on the other side, but this thing healed up pretty good. I mean, it's got that wood's gonna decay at some point and be a problem for this tree. I chose to tap it anyways because I don't think
right there.
This whole thing here was a wound, probably a limb that broke off.
So why did you tap it then?
Well, because this tree is probably not going to last that much longer as it is. You can see it's kind of tall and spindly, and it's surrounded by a bunch of other small trees. I think its top is probably going to break off in the next 10 years or so in a windstorm. It doesn't have really a full canopy. So if if this were my wood lot that I owned and could manage, I would probably cut this tree down in the next 4 or 5 years and use it for firewood. But just as the alder will sprout when you cut it down, so will the maple. Most likely, if you cut this tree right here, it would sprout again. And it would probably make a more healthy, vigorous tree in the long run. So that's like a fairly, it's an old but new practice. So what I mean by that is it's that practice of coppicing, which it's called, when you cut a tree and allow it to sprout and then let it grow for a number of years, is an old practice because it's been around for thousands and thousands of years. But as industrialization and mechanization came along, where there were more and more larger equipment and tools that handled the work that people used to do, we lost the knowledge of labor by hand, which when you're laboring by hand and doing things with animal power and human power, your scale is much smaller. So that's why they would usually coppice trees, because when you do that, you're dealing with much smaller diameter wood for firewood and for timber for building with. Now that we have huge tractors and logging equipment, they just go and cut down everything and bulldoze it over, and they don't have to think about it at all because they have this huge equipment run by diesel that can do all these things. But when you take the scale down to a smaller level to where you're trying to handle it or your animals are trying to handle it, your whole perspective changes on what is a responsible and good way to go about doing certain things. And so we're regaining that knowledge in the sense that when you do that sort of work, it's not on such a fast scale. It's on more of the scale, the time scale of the trees themselves. So you're working within their lifespan instead of just recklessly cutting them down and bulldozing them. And time really gives you the best perspective on what's happening within the forest. Observation is your best tool for knowing how to move forward in the future. Alright, let's pause it for a minute. Alright, we've got all our sap from the forest grove. You can see we have about just over 5 gallons, 5.5 gallons maybe, or 5.1 gallons, 6 gallons. And we're gonna head out back to the house to drop this off before we head to the creek zone. Alright, here we are back at Colson Roots Farm. We're gonna go check our taps down at the creek. See, it's a beautiful day here in the valley with the mountains in the distance. Quite a lovely day. Hopefully we'll have lots of sap down at the creek trees. Got about, let's see, we got about 6 taps down here. Let's see how they did. The other taps are over there in the forest at the edge of the field. We'll check these ones and see how they did. Come on along. Okay. These ones are flowing nice today. Good day for sap collecting in northwest Washington from the Bigleaf Maple. So this area is a little bit different from the other area that we were collecting in as far as tree composition. That other area was the old, this is a nice haul here, it's about up to there. The other area was a logged over conifer forest that the maples sprouted out of. This creek was probably once completely cut over, and there were, I'm talking in the last 100 years or so, the original settler family, European white settler family that settled this area, the Zenders, they ran a lot of cattle, so both areas of this creek were fenced off and pastured. They probably trenched this creek, dug out this creek at some point, which is why it's so steeply eroded. It's got a lot of good vegetation now to hold back the erosion, but it's very well defined. All the trees in here are fairly young, mostly young maples and young alders, some gray birch, some small hemlocks.
What tree is that one? That big one over there that fell
A large
down?
dead hemlock. You can see the licorice fern colonizing it. The licorice fern is a epiphytic fern. Epiphyte is a type of plant that grows in a soilless context on other trees, and that's a good example of it. You can see it's growing mostly out of moss. That's an epiphyte. Most orchids are epiphytes also. So we don't have, mostly our orchids here in the Northwest are not epiphytes. They all are ground soil growing orchids. But the creek here, the trees are mostly of the pioneer species. So after this area was fenced and grazed on both sides and then kind of left to be for a little bit, the dominant trees are mostly the hardwoods that we have here in the Northwest, which are dominated by the alder, the birch, and the bigleaf maple. And then some of the smaller trees that you see in here, it's hard to see exactly, but they're mostly crab apples, swamp crab apples, the Pacific crab apple also, we call it.
There's a lot of crab apples.
Well, they're kind of like the smaller spindly trees. There's some vine maple, some mountain ash. They're sort of our smaller shrubby trees. Also, red osier dogwood is a pretty common one that you find. And then some smaller hemlocks coming back. And we'll make our way back across the creek to the next patch. All the ferns here, they're western sword fern, primarily. Through the salmonberry thicket. But the trees in this creek zone are a little bit in decline, mostly because of their age. Alders are not very long-lived trees. The maples can live pretty long. They can live up to a couple hundred years old, but typically 100 years old or so is when they start to decline. The alders, 25 to 75 years is sort of their lifespan, and because what you can't see is to the south here, up above the creek, is all open pasture. Most of our storms, be it in the winter or the summer or the fall or the spring, come from the southwest. So we get strong winds from the south, and they do a lot of damage to this zone. You can see, I don't see many good examples, but like those birches up over there, all their tops are broken off. That's pretty typical of this zone in here, are broken top trees.
Do you think that big tree fell off from the wind?
Yeah, that looks like windfall or erosion from the creek. I mean, it's right on the edge of the creek. Could have been a combination, probably during a storm of significant rain event, and then also wind, which is pretty common in this area where we get heavy rainfall and winds from the south. This tree here, this little shrub tree on my back here is a red alder, red elderberry. Pretty common shrub in this area. Produces lots of red berries in the fall time. We've been growing a lot of black elders on the farm here. They're a highly medicinal plant for medicinal syrups. The berries are super high antioxidant containing. Very vigorous shrub, grows really good here. The red elder, the native one behind me, is virtually impossible to kill besides digging it up. Great wildlife plant. The birds love the berries.
Can humans eat the berries?
No, you can. There is a way to use the berries for human consumption, but they have a cytotoxin, which is, they're pretty much toxic for human consumption, especially if eaten raw. You can make a wine or a jelly out of them if you discard all the seeds, but that's really hard because the seeds are super small. So no, not really. But there is a native elderberry, the blue elderberry, which isn't as common on the west side of the Cascades. It likes drier climate. But it's a highly medicinal plant also. Alright, we're down to our last two taps here. See, this one did good. The one on the end over there, our last tap, hasn't produced anything at all this season.
Not a single drop?
Which is kind of unusual. I'm not sure of the cause yet.
Some of those trees are really hard to reach.
Yeah. I'm not sure why that tree hasn't produced anything yet. I think we're going to end up moving that tap because it hasn't been productive at all. The tree looks pretty healthy. It's got a large canopy.
See right here, this jug has nothing in it. This has been from like, this little bit right here has been from like, I don't know, like a week almost. And this is all it produced. Isn't that amazing?
All right, we're back. We got all our sap back at the house. Now we're going to show you how we process it. Hand it off to this lovely woman.
You dump it into the pots and boil it down.
How long does it take to boil the sap down?
Probably 2 full pots, about 4 hours.
That's a long time.
It is a long time, and that's just part way. Then we take it inside to the wood stove to finish it so we can keep a good eye on it so it doesn't overboil.
What happens if it overboils?
Then it gets ruined and turns to maple candy instead of maple syrup.
What does maple candy taste like?
Like sweet maple.
This one's about